Are we going to start?
Yeah.
Okay, let's start. Are you tag teaming?
I'm going first.
Okay.
And then.
So Renee DiResta is, I don't know how to introduce you. I think of you as an advocate for good.
Thank you.
And so that's why she's had many roles in many sectors, public, private, startup community, consulted, very important agencies. I don't really know what I can say, but we are very lucky here at the Data Science Institute to have Renee working very closely with Chris Wiggins on this general area of ensuring truth in the digital world. How about that?
Great.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here today.
Should I introduce Chris as well?
Oh, at the same time.
So Chris Wiggins is a professor in the applied physics and applied math department. He's the chief data scientist at the New York Times, and he's a very active member of the Data Science Institute.
Thank you. So what I thought we might do is have Renee speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then that'll give Renee a chance to respond to what she thinks is useful or not useful about the things I have to say, and then I can do likewise. Or maybe I'll go first since I'll have more time. Or no, you go first.
Okay.
I'll have time to think about what I was going to say, and then likewise, and then we'll have Q&A. So please.
All right, sounds great. Hi, so I am director of research at a company called New Knowledge. We build detection and mitigation systems looking at ways to, restore truth or defend public discourse. I'm also a Mozilla Fellow, and I am echoing right now. Hang on a second.
I got it.
You did. Okay, great. Amazing. So also a Mozilla Fellow in Media, Misinformation, and Trust. So I've done a bunch of work on social network manipulation over the last few years, but what we're talking about today is something that relates to a specific feature that's very, very common to most social platforms and also to many economic platforms, which is the recommendation engine. And a lot of the time when I talk about my work, I talk about the emphasis on the fact that it's a systems level problem. So misinformation doesn't just live on Facebook, it doesn't just live on Twitter. It's either ideologically or economically motivated, and the incentive is to get it as broadly disseminated across the entire ecosystem as possible, with the goal of reaching as many people as you can, as many different types of people as you can, reaching people where they are. Recommender systems are really interesting to us because they are what we call a curatorial surface. So curatorial surfaces is where the platform begins to take a proactive action in serving a particular type of content. So rather than the, so the systems aren't passive, right? As soon as you get away from a timeline-based system on a social feed, there is an algorithm behind it, which means that someone somewhere has designed a weighting system or a ranking system that elevates certain content over certain other content. And of course, the reason for this is because there's so much content on social networks that the network has to decide what to show you. So the other two curatorial surfaces that we talk about a lot, where we feel platforms have made active judgment calls in the form of algorithms, are trending and search. Those are two other areas where ranking comes into play, and there's an area which the platform makes a judgment call. So, of course, the goals of recommender systems are to delight customers. The goal really is to make customers feel happy when they're on the network, to keep them coming back. It's to learn more about customer preferences. So these are adaptive systems. When a user is presented with choices and clicks on them, the algorithm refines its perception of the persona of the user. So the system learns. In the case of product recommendation systems, the goal is to drive people to products that they're likely to purchase. So we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the work that I've been doing looking at Amazon and economic recommender systems. And then on the more typical social platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, these platforms are all attention brokers. So they're competing directly with each other, not because of the same features, but because they need to maximize user time on their site. This was really interesting in the Senate hearing recently when Mr. Zuckerberg testified and Lindsey Graham asked him, do you think you're a monopoly? He said, no, sir, we think that there's other networks that people can go to. But the interesting challenge is one of the reasons the platforms don't collaborate more on information sharing around disinformation is they are fundamentally competitive. And that's because the goal is to maximize time on site, and a recommendation engine is one tool that keeps you seeing things that you want, which keeps you coming back to the site. So just to go into how it works, I love this example. I think some of you in the room are a lot younger than me, but does anybody remember the Tuscan milk jug on Amazon? No, okay, so I'll explain it. So the Tuscan milk jug is literally a gallon of milk. And you'll see, unfortunately, I didn't have enough room on the screen to also show the milk jug, but the Tuscan milk jug was one of the first lulzy review manipulation exercises, which was back in early 2000s. Amazon started selling food. This milk jug appeared on the site, and it's literally just a gallon of milk. It was called the Tuscan milk jug, and thousands of people went to leave reviews, and they were very, very funny. And so these are like 5-star reviews about how like it makes a great projectile, or like 1-star reviews where they're like, it didn't make me feel like I was transported to Tuscany, or these. So there were like these really funny lulzy reviews, and there's thousands of them. And so what you're seeing here is something that's really interesting, which is Amazon has a degree of granularity in the way that it understands its customers that's actually remarkable. And one thing I love about it is how people, as somebody who looks at this stuff, you can really see the signals that they're looking at. So if you go to Amazon to buy milk, especially now in the year since 2002 or whenever Tuscan milk jug happened, you have what else people actually buy, which is beans and pasta and the stuff you're going to use to make your dinner, right? You buy milk and then you buy your groceries. But if you look at customers who viewed this item also viewed, you'll see uranium ore, which has 1,400 reviews, how to avoid huge ships, which has 1,400 likes, and the auto exec wheelmate attachable work surface tray, which has 1,200 reviews. And so this is actually Amazon referring you out to other products that were viewed by people who go and look at the reviews for the lulz. So the interesting distinction there is that you're not going to go and buy uranium ore after looking at milk. But if you know anything about Amazon, like your internet culture, 3-Wolf Moon is a little bit down the ways, and there's like a gigantic gummy snake that weighs 95 pounds or something ridiculous like that. There's like, definitely go to Tuscan milk jug and have a look at what pops up, because there's like 7 pages of this. So it's an interesting distinction in the sophistication and the granularity in which the system understands this is what people buy versus this is what people look at. So how does this happen? So content-based filtering is that top line there, right? So it's something that makes sense to show you given something that you've previously looked at. So if I like to read slightly left of center Washington Post articles, a recommendation engine serving textual content on a social platform is likely to continue to serve that up to me. If I click on a book and I'm interested, it knows that I like physics books or something, it's going to continue to show me different products in the physics category that it thinks I'm going to like. So content-based filtering is taking signal from things that I have already indicated that I like. So it's learning about me and my preferences based on my clicks. So that's kind of that top line there. Collaborative filtering is the other way that the other kind of primary way that recommendation systems are built. And what this looks at is, what do people who are like me like? So I'm 37, I live in San Francisco, I have 2 kids. It knows that about me. You probably have noticed in the Cambridge Analytica story, like you can go in and look at your Facebook data. You could previously go in and look at your Google ad targeting data. So you can go in there and get a sense of like what your cues and clicks have communicated to the system about what you like. So Facebook has this profile of me as a 37-year-old woman with 2 kids living in San Francisco. So what is it going to serve me? When it's kind of like, when there's a exhaustion of content that it knows I'm going to like, there's this other option, which is to serve me content that people like me like. So what do other 37-year-old moms in San Francisco like? This is why I get referred into like mom groups and like natural woo-woo groups and stuff like this, like all the time. But collaborative filtering it's really useful when you're onboarding somebody. So if you think about when you sign up for Twitter, or in the early days of signing up for an engine, the system knows nothing about you because you haven't clicked, you haven't given it any cues. But what it does know is some amount of information that it's going to get through your initial sign up. Like if you're signing up for Twitter, you have geolocation on presumably, or an IP, it can intuit where you are. And so I once signed up for an account when I was sitting in an airport in Chicago, and the recommendation that the recommended follows list that it gave me was all Chicago sports, Chicago newscasters, because it has no idea of who I am. I didn't link in or authenticate with another social profile that it can potentially draw from. So what it has about me instead is only my geographical location. And so to start the filtering process, to start the relationship with the customer, it wants me to have a good experience. And so it shows me things that it thinks I'm going to like based on this signal. So those are the kind of two ways that recommender systems work. So what is the problem? Well, the goal is to show people what it thinks that, what the goal is for the recommendation engine to show you what it thinks you want to see. The key KPI that they usually use is something like time on site for a social network, or actual click-throughs, like likes versus purchases, the way that Amazon broke that out. So it's looking at what is the KPI that it wants to achieve. And the algorithm is tested, very small tweaks here and there to see if it improves the KPI that it wants to achieve. So when your KPI is time on site or purchases, the recommendation engine is just designed to maximize that. So the problem is that occasionally it does some really unfortunate things. So the recommendation engine is remarkably powerful, especially on a platform like Facebook that has extraordinary quantities of information about many, many, many different types of users. So some of the earliest writing I did on social network manipulation was looking into why conspiracy theories seem to be disproportionately amplified. And so it wasn't just abstract interest. Like I wanted to get a law passed in California to eliminate vaccine opt-outs. And so I started really looking at how the anti-vaccine movement operated on social networks. And I joined a couple of groups. This was one of them. And I noticed that over time, it went from referring me into homeopathy and sort of general, lefty pseudoscience type stuff, GMOs, chemtrails, all that, the normal anti-vax correlated conspiracy theories. And it started sending me into Pizzagate groups. And this was before Pizzagate got popular. This was actually pretty early on. And the thing that was really interesting about this is that it's kind of a reflection of how the anti-vaccine movement itself was evolving over time, which was to say, prior to 2015, prior to this law in California, it was very much like a lefty narrative around pseudoscience and autism. But in 2005, it became in 2015, they really worked hard to draw in this deeply libertarian, it is an interference with your rights for the government to make you vaccinate your kids. And so they started really reaching out to these at the time it was the Tea Party, like the alt-right didn't really exist yet. So they were really reaching out to the Tea Party. And so as this new collection of people moved in, this new collection of profiles joining anti-vaccine groups, what I think is happening is that the recommendation engine is recognizing that the profile of people in this group is slightly different. And so it's going to show me some of the things that are correlated via collaborative filtering with this new demographic of people that is now a substantial percentage of this group that I'm in, so it starts to serve even the original kind of left-wing pseudoscience crew begins to be served Pizzagate. So when we talk, the other area we saw this on Twitter was with ISIS accounts. We started to see, users who would follow, sometimes people, basically we called it like a radicalization engine because the platforms would tell us that it was way too hard for them to figure out where these things were happening or how people were finding, jihadi accounts to follow. You would go to them and you would show Twitter, if I follow one jihadi account, your recommendation engine is going to serve me up 5 more. So even if the engineer or the person don't feel that they have like insight into how to identify these accounts or how to see the kind of conspiracy correlation matrix, the recommendation engine actually does. So I'll talk a little bit about some specific work I got involved in. I did a lot of work on the tracking the Internet Research Agency propaganda. One night I went looking for it on Pinterest. And unfortunately, didn't have enough room for all the slides, but you've probably all seen what the Russian memes look like. The purpose of this talk is to talk about the recommendation engine. So I had a Pinterest account. You know, I joined Pinterest when it was in beta. I planned my wedding on it. I planned my kid's first birthday on it. I use it for recipes. I have, you know, dozens of boards, and I used to have like a lifestyle blog where I would share my own photos and stuff. So Pinterest had years and years and years and years of history about me. And then I spent one night tracking down Russian propaganda content on it. And I logged in the next morning because I had found the content and I wanted to make sure we'd archived it all before it disappeared, which is what happens when you give the platforms notice. And my entire feed had transformed into far right, you know, Dinesh D'Souza videos and Russian craft projects, Russian language craft projects. That's a skirt pattern. And I thought, oh, how interesting. Because the people who were looking at the Russian propaganda content, this was, so I should clarify, they were not actively using it as a dissemination channel, it was simply a repository. So they had this cache of memes. They didn't seem to be actively sharing it, it seemed to be more of like a storage library, almost like their own private bookmark. So I was in there and there wasn't a lot of activity on it, but I was clicking around. And like I said, I log in the next morning and I've got far-right extremist content, and then I've got Russian crafts. And that's because the other people who are engaging with that content are predominantly using the site in Russian, you know, they're living in Russia. And presumably other people who did see the content, did engage in it, did pin it, were the, you know, the target demographic for the particular boards that I was on was the anti-Muslim stuff and the anti-immigrant stuff. And so that's where I assume that came from. So I think that in this case, it's an example of a recommendation engine really overweighting on recency. My entire history was not relevant to it anymore. The only thing that mattered was serving me something that was very similar to the thing I had searched for the night before. And that's because on a site like Pinterest, one would expect that they're testing this. And that's where they're saying like, oh, you know, when you go to Pinterest, you're usually looking for something to buy or you're looking for a recipe to make or something like that. So they're going to show you something that's very recent as opposed to a platform that has more of a sense of you as a person. I hope I explained that well. Everybody seems to know what I'm talking about. Okay. So the latest.
Well, did you test that hypothesis by doing something completely different that next night?
It's pretty much back to normal. It took a couple weeks of me clicking on like searching for like steak recipes again, but it did eventually go back to normal. I get the usual like baby clothes and, you know, and steak recipes now. But it was remarkable to me how fast it happened. It was literally overnight. It was very, very dramatic. And it was extremely, like this wasn't, you know, I read a lot of mainstream conservative sites. This was not that. This was very, very, very far out to the far right, the stuff that it was showing me. I got on the plane the next morning. I wish had I realized what was going to happen, I would have screen capped all of it, but I don't always think that far ahead. The latest work that I've been doing is on the economic stuff, which is Amazon is unique because you have like one platform where you can, it's like contained. You can do all types of different manipulation. You can game the recommendation engine by gaming the stars, right? So it's the way that Amazon generates signal is through a lot of the star reviews. So if you can manipulate the star reviews, you're going to, you know, win, so to speak, the Amazon SEO game. It's not, of course, as basic as like a binary 5 stars versus 1 star. There's a couple of other signals that go into it, but it's a significant factor. And so I started looking at categories that there was a lot of competition from sellers who had previously been on Alibaba, apparel, clothing. And I started seeing the same products on Alibaba and Amazon. And at the time I was actually looking at more like the supply chain arbitrage, people wanting to capitalize on Amazon's delivery and Amazon's reputation. So sellers who had traditionally sold products that Americans didn't think were very reputable on Alibaba, literally selling the exact same thing on Amazon, and how many more sales they were getting on Amazon because Amazon had this legitimacy, Amazon had return protection. And also people I don't think realize, like they would give themselves a different brand, like an American name, on Amazon versus on Alibaba, where it would still be the much more traditional engagement with the Chinese factory. So I was looking at that and I was saying, how are these like people who make what really are like quite low quality, virtually disposable clothes, climbing to the top of Amazon's clothing system? Like the price isn't that different. Like what are they doing? And so I started looking at the gamification of reviews. So Amazon made incentivized reviews illegal in October of last year because it started to realize that when people had incentivized reviews, even if they said that they were reviewing fairly, the reviews were usually like 1.5 stars higher than, like, so the rating would be about 1.5 stars higher than it would be if you took those reviews out. So Amazon, of course, needs to maintain the perception of integrity for its customers as a place to find and search for products. It's become the product search engine. And so Amazon eliminated the, what were previously disclosed. People would write, I received this, I'm writing this review in exchange for a discount or something. After Amazon made that illegal, the manipulation moved to Facebook. So there are these groups of people. These are like 7. There are probably over 100. I just have scrolling screens of groups with Amazon review in the name. Walmart review, anywhere where there is a crowdsourced review, there is a community on Facebook to manipulate it. And so the way that the game works is you go in and you join, and a seller posts a product. The seller accounts are almost always sock puppets. They're not the real names. It uses a stock photo as the profile picture. You go in, you comment, you say interested, and then they move the conversation to DM. So you get a DM. And by the way, once you've indicated interested on one thing, you get so many unsolicited DMs because everybody has decided that you are like a person who is willing to do this for them. And so I was getting hundreds of these unsolicited DMs. And the way it works is they give you very, very detailed instructions. So I have a Prime account, over 10 years old. I've left reviews for things authentically in the past, and so I'm considered like a prime target here. And so what the sellers do is they give you instructions and they say, you're gonna add it to your wish list, you're gonna add 2 other products in the category to your wish list. We're not gonna give you a link to click through, you're gonna go search through Amazon's search function so that you bypass the click through a direct link. You're gonna sit there, you're gonna leave it on your wish list for 3 days, then you're gonna go back and buy it, then you're gonna send me the order number, and then I'm gonna PayPal you back for the cost of the product plus extra money for reviews. So that's how it works. And as you can see, they're like 45,000 members in these groups, or some with 70, 80,000. They have them by country because Amazon has .co.uk, .it, et cetera. So there's scams by country. And that's the way the process works. So the review shows up as verified, because, yeah.
What's the general profile of these sorts of companies?
It's a lot of times it's brands, and they'll so it's Chinese were most of the ones I encountered, brands, and they will do this scam with a number of different reps in a number of different groups, and the reps get really like, guys, I have to make my numbers this month, can somebody help me review such and such, and there's a lot of back and forth. I saw people in there commenting that they'd done this for like $16,000 worth of stuff last year. So there are people who are like, one guy's like, I'm a top 4,000 reviewer and I've done $16,000 so far this year. So this is where the evasion is interesting. And the other interesting thing about this to me was that technically Facebook is not responsible for this, right? It's not Facebook that is, Facebook is indemnified under CDA 230 and other things from anything that exists on its platform. It's not like Amazon can sue Facebook over this. Amazon has in the past sued individuals who are running these scams. Amazon did, when we notified them that the story was going to come out, immediately go through and start wiping the reviews and deleting people's accounts. And they wipe the profiles of the people who are reviewers, and in some cases revoke their Amazon accounts. So there is like a penalty when they catch you.
You mean Amazon didn't even know this was happening under their nose?
If they did, they.
Oh, I see. That's what I was going to ask. Is when did this exist? So
Facebook, when we also when Washington Post reached out to Facebook for comment also, and a lot of the groups disappeared. There's still some that are there, but a lot of them disappeared.
There's still a huge electronic trail that you're talking about PayPal and
oh, totally.
Your Facebook account.
Nobody's responsible. Who goes and looks for this?
Amazon has
All right, well, this is the point, right? Like,
Amazon has it even passed a law, right? It even worked to pass a law to make these reviews.
I guess it's not even in Amazon's best interest.
Amazon, I think it is in their best interest, because once these stories come out, like when this came out and when Good Morning America covered it, all of a sudden you have hundreds of thousands of comments on the Good Morning America, like watches and comments saying like, I always thought Amazon reviews were a scam. This is hugely bad. I mean, for the platforms, the issue is integrity, right? Like Amazon makes money because people trust it. And so when you erode that trust, I mean, the whole point of this, and I want to keep going on the recommendation engine stuff, because I don't want to take up too much time. But this is mass fraud in part to game the recommendation engine. So some people do it for economic reasons, but other people will actually do it for ideological reasons. So the truther thing is also really fascinating on Amazon, which is to say, like, so the truth about cancer has 1,689 positive reviews, all 5-star. Basically, the quote unquote truth about cancer is that like it either doesn't exist or it's a vast government conspiracy and chemotherapy will kill you. Okay, this is the first page of Amazon search results for books about cancer, and I screen capped this last night. And the other thing I'm going to show you, see where it says bestseller in oncology? That is literally the second result on the page. Notice it has 3 stars. The book came out like 2 days ago. The only reason it's a bestseller is because the category is so thin. So this is the same kind of thing we see on Google News when there's no good search results to return, and so it returns like whatever it can get. And so if you go searching for a cancer book, you're gonna get like, this again is by some quack who's like a chiropractor, and the alternative therapy is like juice. So this is the kind of stuff that you see. We see this with cancer, we see this with vaccines, we see this through like political extremism. This is it's epidemic in their book and in their movie categories. Documentaries are the worst. Once you engage with this for 2 seconds, by the way, as I'll get to, you start to get it sent to you an email. Based on your recent visit to Amazon, we thought you might like, and then it's gonna give me, like guaranteed this is gonna happen by tonight, I'm gonna have like 12 cancer quackery books emailed to me by Amazon because it wants to close the sale. So, yeah.
So the book about cancer, that's not run by so
No, it absolutely is. Ty Bollinger also sells documentaries and supplements.
Supplements. FDA
Supplements.
approved.
Yeah.
They're not. No.
Yeah. No, there's absolutely, and the guy also has the truth about vaccines, and now has like the truth about pet vaccines. Why you shouldn't vaccinate your pets, because the rabies vaccine is gonna like give your dog autism or something. I'm not kidding. There was like a Guardian article about like, doctors, veterinarians announce like your dog can't get autism. This was a story. This is like, we're in the realm of like the surreal at this point. But so here are the incentives to game. It delivers significant economic benefits. If you're on Amazon, if you're on Facebook, I mean, look at, we just had hearings, Diamond and Silk, right? We just had hearings about this, whether your right to monetize is a fundamental First Amendment right, whether because once the platform downranks you, you do lose legitimacy, you do lose sales, you do lose attention. And a woman actually showed up to YouTube's offices with a gun because she was angry that she had been demonetized and downranked. So I want to, let's see, can I skip ahead? This was Facebook acknowledging in a formal statement to the Senate that yes, its recommendation engine did push regular people to Russian pages. So Facebook's recommendation engine was actually serving up the Russian propaganda pages. And the interesting thing there is, again, we get to the question of who is responsible? Who is responsible when an algorithm designed by a platform pushes people or nudges them in a particular direction, or serves up extremist content, or serves up radicalizing content? How do we think about that? I get asked a lot, how big is the problem? And the answer is like, I really don't know, because the only people who know are the platforms. Because I can only see, like, I can have a bunch of different accounts and they have different personas, and I can do this logged in, logged out. And I can have different indications of like, anecdotal things, but ultimately the filtering is personalized for what it thinks I am. So it's really hard to have any kind of like base level.
But from what we have heard, they don't know either.
I think that's probably true. And
What's the algorithm? Like, it's machine learning, right? They're using these algorithms that aren't, like, they're not closed form mathematical equations. They're not stable. They're not well understood.
Right.
I mean, you can't track it. It's not like Walmart where you can track, like take hours and hours to track, where something went.
Yeah.
Financially, like we don't know what the computers are tracking.
All you know is like what they're optimized.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's it.
Right, so you know what they're
Yeah,
optimizing
but
for.
I
And
think
then,
optimizing a very simple platform of the data set. When the data set was trained on algorithms, the algorithm has a very clean data. And when you apply that algorithm to a network, that is much more complicated than the training. That's
Yeah.
what they don't understand.
yeah, and we've seen some really interesting things. Like I'm talking about recommender systems, but like search has gotten that wrong in like spectacular ways a couple times. In like, the training sets have no pictures of Black people in them and stuff, and then it doesn't know what to do when it sees Black people. Yeah, no, there's been some really horribly, painful. There was a great thread on Twitter that we can try to find and bump up about like unintended consequences of AI systems. Did you see this? Like papers were, yeah, the surprising AI. Oh, do you? Okay, great. Well, I'm gonna move on to Chris's part of this now. I'll just, in response to these other things, it's, I wrote an article for Wired about this, so my thoughts are probably more cleanly articulated there. But the question of who is responsible, I mean, there's really only one answer to that, right? Which is the platforms. I mean, they built the system, and this is theirs. And so when there are unintended consequences, it really does fall to the platforms to monitor them and to fix it. When Amazon reviews are gamed, interestingly, Google search results become inaccurate, right? And so there's a lot of second order effects that make their way through the system when one party doesn't do a good enough job, like keeping its yard clean. And so that's where we try to get at who is responsible. The other thing is, like, we're serving up content. Do we want to be serving up radicalizing content to people who are prone to radicalization? Because that's what we're doing, right? When we're serving anti-vaxxers, anti-government conspiracy theories, and then pushing them from Pizzagate into QAnon and then down the rabbit hole, and we wonder, how do we have polarized communities that operate with their own set of facts? That's because this is what they're served consistently over and over and over again. So the question here really is, when you argue, is adjusting the algorithm censorship? That was the subject of a whole Senate hearing, which was insane. And the issue there is, no, it's not censorship. You don't have a right to free amplification. You don't have a right to be served up in a recommender system. What we're trying to articulate is that the platforms really are capable of allowing the content to exist on the platform without proactively volunteering it. And can we think about that as a way where people who actively go and search for Pizzagate find Pizzagate, but people who have never even heard of Pizzagate don't necessarily need to be nudged in that direction? And so thinking about, instead of talking about censorship, talking about it more in the way of like a nudge or choice architecture, saying, is there a way to rethink, reframe the KPIs where instead of time on site, we incorporate other, other potential indications that would take into account impact, which is what Chris is going to talk about. So.
Good. So Renee and I thought we would do a pair of talks on different aspects. And Renee, I think, has done a great job over the last several years on forensic work to encounter problems and recommendations. And I thought I would talk about some ways of thinking about solutions. And in particular, the title I chose was, Can We Make the Internet's Recommendation Engines More Ethical? And the material is really taken from a post I wrote on the DSI website about a month ago about ethical principles. But the title itself is actually taken from Renee. So Renee wrote this blog post that she mentioned earlier this month about recommendations and how to fix them. And the line, can we make the internet's recommendations engines more ethical, is taken directly from that. So I thought I would briefly just provoke some thoughts here around recommendations. What are they? Although Renee's already done that. And what I mean by ethical, and then what it would mean to make, how do we make anything happen about recommendation engines? Renee has already pointed out one of the funnest recommendation out there, which is Amazon, in part because Amazon's the everything store, so you might get recommended any damn thing. And the other is because Amazon seems to have worked real hard at recommendation engines about 20 years ago, and then has let it not be so great. For example, I looked up recommendation engines for fun yesterday, and this is a screen capture. Admittedly, not the first few items, but you get crazy things like 1978 Chevy spark plug recommendation chart, which is not a recommendation engine, a sponsored thing for kids, and then actually a book about recommendation engines in Scala, which is pretty much the kind of thing I was looking for. But recommendation engines, as she pointed out, also are tied into ideology and also the way we shape our professional, political, and personal realities in the palms of our hands. So after the last election, I made Twitter accounts, one that just followed sort of red-leaning things and one that followed blue-leaning things. And yesterday I was in a meeting, so I looked up what's being recommended to me on Twitter, and you do see some things that are overlapping, some things are different and definitely in order, but it's interesting to think about how at the same time, because this, you can look at the screen capture, it's the same time, in the same world, you know, all of these information platforms are recommending different realities to you. So that's a bit about what the recommendations are. Let me turn to the difficult word, which is ethical. So I've been part of many, many conversations among technologists the last half year in particular about what the hell is ethical and what do we mean when we talk about ethical. And technologists are not historians. There's a techie fuzzy divide, well documented between the two cultures, but having co-taught a class with a historian the last 2 years, I've found them very useful. And I keep thinking about, because most of my connection with history is either talking to real life people or via The Onion, like this one that says, historians politely remind nations to check what's happened in the past before making their decisions. That is not happening by and large in most of the conversations that I have with technologists talking about ethics. So I thought I might actually talk about ancient times like this report. So how many people have heard of the Belmont report? Okay, one or two, please. So, I'm sorry, what did somebody say? Thank you, good. Yes, you've proven my point, which is if you are raised a certain way, then when you hear the words Belmont report, kabam, you think IRB, which are different things. So the Belmont report is a report in which a bunch of people sat down and thought really hard, you know, like 704 pages worth of hard about how to define ethics. And how to define ethics is different from how to enforce ethics. So I say the word Belmont report, and somebody who's properly raised as a researcher says IRB. Right? We are at a point now in 2018 where we are unable to disambiguate how to enforce ethics with how to define ethics. And that leads to problems like this, like Facebook having to write a paper about evolving the IRB, because when you say, how should a platform company be ethical, you get people who say, well, it can't be ethical because there's no IRB in Facebook. So think about that. IRB is one of many myriad possible mechanisms for enforcing ethics. It is not a mechanism for defining ethics. Right? The Belmont report being an example of an extremely well-researched report, 704 pages just for volume 2, the appendix, about how to define ethics. That's completely different from how we enforce ethics. We need to keep those things separate. So that's one provocation I want people to keep in mind, is that we can define ethics. We could even take the same definition of ethics from the Belmont report, which I remind you was long before the Common Rule, which was before IRB. A lot of really smart people put a lot of brains times 3 pounds times hours, like a lot of brain work went into defining ethics via the Belmont report. That does not have to be constrained by what is now the modern IRB, which relates to mostly academic research. So Facebook did this in part because just 2 years earlier, they had published this paper where they empirically proved that they can make you sad. Hope you know this paper by Kramer et al. Which had so many ethical concerns that it actually had a statement of ethical concern written by the editors of PNAS, in which they pointed out, well, basically you accepted the terms of service because this experiment was conducted by, okay, also it happened at Facebook rather than Cornell, although the authors were split, therefore Cornell IRB doesn't fall under Cornell's Human Research Protection Program. That's a perfect example. Right? Because we think of ethics as being conflated with IRB, we think that somehow defining ethics or being ethical is limited by the existence of this mechanism for enforcing ethics, right? So please, one thing that I think would benefit our species is if we remember that defining ethics and being ethical is different than whether or not you have an IRB that rules you, which is a statement about enforcing ethics. This paper was consistent with Facebook's data use policy, which all of the users agreed to. So that was part of Facebook's defense. Thinking about how to define ethics leads you to a lot of different blog posts. So fortunately for us, in addition to blog posts by people from two cultures, there's a nice book. If you'd like to look at a book about social science research, including ethics, there's this nice book by Matt Salganik, who's a Columbia alumnus, chapter 6 of which is all about ethics. And so I want to draw your attention to 2 punchlines from that book. One is this counterintuitive punchline. Think of research ethics as continuous, not discrete. Thinking about ethics as continuous sounds like some sort of relativism. and sets off all sorts of alarm bells for you. I want to try to walk you through how you might think about ethics as continuous rather than discrete. This is actually an idea which people who come from legal theory are accustomed to, right? Like in the law, you have certain things that are hard rules. Like the president's got to be 35 years old. You can't be elected president unless you're 35 years old. That is a rule. It does not require you to work to interpret it. You simply apply it. And then there are other things like principles, like you shouldn't be able to profit from a crime. So that is a principle which you can imagine interpreting in different ways and applying under different contexts. So in legal theory, people talk about rules, standards, and principles. Rules are clear and rigid, and you simply apply them. Standards are somewhere in the middle. You might have to interpret it, and principles are designed to be flexible. So if you're raised as an engineer, you might think, well, I don't like things to be ambiguous. I like things that compiles unambiguously to the same executable. But if you're an engineer, you also don't like people to make up ridiculous principles because these people don't understand technology, and as soon as the technology changes, these rules shouldn't be brittle. Right? So this is one way of thinking about how we can have it in all ways, is we should have some principles which should be flexible and able to apply in different cases, and rules that might be different for different contexts. That is, principles are somehow larger than standards, which are larger than rules. So that's one idea that's accepted in legal theory, and it's also underlying the ethical principles as defined by the Belmont report. So what are those principles? One particular view of the principles distilled from Belmont report, and also a later work by computer scientists called the Menlo report, are these four. You may like them or you may not. Respect for persons, beneficence, meaning doing good and not doing harm, justice, and respect for law and public interests are one set of principles. Drilling down a little bit more, you can see, well, respect for persons includes things like informed consent, autonomy. Beneficence includes ideas like do no harm, which often for many people, that is the first thing they think of when they think about ethics. Justice includes ideas like fairness, including fair risk, but also fair benefit. And rule of law and public interest includes doing things that are compliant with the law, knowing the law, and also transparency and accountability. Okay, so this is one way of thinking about ethics. It's granular, it has the right level of granularity, like it shouldn't be just one thing like don't be evil, but it shouldn't just be like hundreds and hundreds of brittle and self-contradictory rules. How do we make? What does it mean to make a recommendation engine at all, let alone to make it be a particular way? You may think, if you come from like academia, that to make a recommendation engine, you write down a loss function. Maybe you write down a loss function and you write down an algorithm. Actually, building a recommendation product is much more dynamic than that and is not so static. This is a nice graph from a paper by Carlos Uribe, who was for many years at Netflix before he moved to Facebook to try to solve fake news. Good luck, Carlos. And this is from a paper specifically about the Netflix recommendation engine. And one of the nice graphs is this very dynamic graph about the iterative process. Training models is what we teach academics to do. Evaluating models, maybe if you get your hands on a data set, you can do. And if you're a scientist, then that generates hypotheses which go back and suggest new models. None of this has to do with actually deploying a product and interacting with human beings. The recommendations are an example of human-computer interfaces, right? You have to interact with human beings, and the way human beings interact with the algorithm by supplying data totally changes what other people see. In fact, that's a lot of what Renee presented. Eventually, you decide whether or not it's doing a good job or a bad job relative to something else. In statistics, that would be called a randomized controlled trial, but in industry, that's called an A/B test. In order to make an A/B test meaningful, you have to have some idea about what is the thing for which you are optimizing. For example, as Renee mentioned, time on site. So the KPIs sort of go there, and you roll it out. KPIs are key performance indicators. An example of a KPI or a quantitative goal Renee mentioned was time on site. Here's a memo from a VP at Facebook that got a lot of attention in the last few months, although the memo was written in 2006, that says, the ugly truth is we believe connecting people so deeply that anything that allows us to connect more people more often is the de facto good. So this is a statement about clearly what this person thinks they should be optimizing. We should be optimizing connecting people at all costs. As pointed out in questions, just by optimizing something, particularly in a complex system or in a place where you don't really understand the model, let alone in a place where you couple to human beings, making something optimized doesn't mean that you understand what it will do or you have some quantitative sense for the solution. So this is a GIF that I made from a paper that Renee mentioned about the result of making a computational robot and trying to get the robot to walk. So you try to get this robot to optimize its velocity, and it might do all sorts of crazy things, like just flip itself over and crawl on its back. This has been known for a while in computer science. Actually, this is an older one from 1994, where you're trying to get a robot to walk. And this one in particular exploits a bug in the game physics for this very old game engine for how the physics works in the system. And it realizes that it can simply vibrate and catapult itself into the air. That is, you really don't know what these algorithms are going to do until you deploy them. So responsible deploying of an algorithm means you're willing to monitor it. And you might have to monitor more things than just time on page or other sort of quantitative metrics. Some of the things that matter are not things that can be expressed in terms of a SQL query. Renee mentioned delight, for example. So you might be trying to build an algorithm to delight people, but delight is not something that's easily made into a SQL query. It's not something that you can easily quantify in code. So I claim, please. Yep.
Point about you optimize for what you measure, and this based on my experience at Microsoft, where Adela was the new CEO, teenagers, something like that. It was lines of code. That's how we were measured. Lines of code. How many lines of code? How many test cases? It was all about the code or test cases.
Developers.
Took over. It was daily active users, monthly active. It was all about user engagement, number of users and user engagement. And the EVPs had dashboards. Every morning they would wake up and they would look at the DAU, the NAU. It was not lines of code anymore. It completely changed the behavior of the business, everything completely changed because you were measured by different metrics.
I claim that there's a responsible deployment of a recommendation engine also involves some user experience operations. So I'll call this UXO for user experience. UX is a normal term in design. UXO, I don't think anybody would say that, but user experience operations would be, as part of your operations of the engine, see what people's experiences are. Right? And you will not be able to know in advance what sort of pathological experiences they are. Either you have to talk to them, you have to be one of them, which in engineering is called dog fooding, when you use the product and you just know what it's like. But you could just go talk to people. You could ask them, what crazy things are you seeing? And it's far better to ask them so that they tell you rather than telling the Washington Post or the New York Times or something else. Ideally, that user experience operations should then drive iteration. In addition to generating hypotheses because of what you learn from optimizing a KPI, you should be listening to people and allowing them to tell you what sort of pathological behaviors they are seeing. That doesn't necessarily lend itself to things that are automated in terms of quantitative metrics. That's why comment moderation at scale is so difficult. So a concrete way of thinking about how to take ethics as people have thought about it since the 70s, if not earlier, and integrate it into working practice in a company is to think about how your KPIs or your objectives and key results themselves could respond to or derive from the rules, standards, and principles. That is, as you're deploying some recommendation engine and you observe the way people look at it, think through a small set of principles, more principles than don't be evil, not as many principles as hundreds and hundreds of self-contradictory rules, but some number of principles that allows you to think, are these people experiencing something that is consistent with those principles? Again, I remind you of one particular level of granularity here. Are you deploying an algorithm that differentially puts harm on different groups? Are you writing an algorithm and deploying an algorithm which leaves some people constrained in their autonomy, which may seem odd to you. I'll try to illustrate that. Lots of people have thought for a while about how autonomy is actually challenged by recommendation engines. Renee commented on, touched on this briefly. And in terms of an algorithm for technologists, your KPIs can't conflict with your principles if you don't state principles. So the first step is to define your principles. I like those 5 that I enumerated, which are basically the Belmont report, the Menlo report principles, and also safety, which particularly if you think about information security and safety might be included. Next, before you deploy the KPI or deploy the engine, thinking about a KPI you'd like to optimize, think about whether that KPI is already, from the face of it, in direct contradiction with one of your principles. And then once you deploy it, agree to responsible deploy. That is, you have to monitor what the user experience is quantitatively and qualitatively, which might involve asking users what they're experiencing. And then iterate, right? As you realize that the experience is somehow not aligned with your principles, you should change things. Now, Renee pointed out some concerns and challenges here. One challenge is the concern of autonomy. You may not think that autonomy, please.
I just want to bring up something to
Please do.
compare against this last one. So,
yeah.
So KPI is standing by principles. So I, at the risk of sounding too top times or top anything about this. So there's I heard I think it was Elon Musk mentioning in the case of an AGI, what sort of what general optimization function you have to give it. You have to give it something. If it was supposed to control what the answer was to optimize for freedom, as if that's the one thing that say would be good. So it's sort of like principles are what you have to stand by here, and so I thought that was similar to sort of freedom. The sort of the AI is completely in control of everything. Like if it has influence over you and knows you perfectly, what should it be trying to do? And the answer to that is freedom.
Yes. We as individuals sometimes create entities that increase the probability that something very, very good will happen to us. Those are cases in which we would like more freedom. Sometimes we create entities that lower the probability that something very bad will happen to us. It may be that people with extremely high net worth would like to have more freedom because they often are in places of incredible capability. So different people might have different views about what is the thing that they want to optimize for. Please.
Do the people who build these algorithms, asking them to monitor the experiments, the user experience, do they actually have the tools to be able to monitor if really what's happening is you have the technology interaction with society in really complex ways? So do you, even if you're just looking at your stats on what's happening with users, is that enough to be able to monitor a lot of complex social?
I don't think it scales as well as something that could be monitored by automated SQL queries. But I mean, I think part of Renee's collected work for the last 5 years shows that there's lots of ways that you can monitor unintended consequences, by forensics, by algorithmic accountability, or algorithmic forensics, like actually just investigating what is the context, what happens when I deploy this algorithm. Even in the second slide where I made 2 Twitter accounts, like that is itself a type of algorithmic accountability, just auditing what that algorithm does.
And should that be the responsibility just of the people who create this, or now is that responsibility of the
So Renee makes the point that she thinks the responsibilities in the platform companies, the world is a complicated system in which we have entities that protect us from bad things happening, governance organizations, or the government itself. We depend on these private companies to solve problems that we think are not in the interest of the government or too big for us individuals. We individuals, sometimes working in concert with the fourth estate in the form of press, perform all of these regulatory functions. Responsibility is, I think, larger than the scope of this particular talk, but I see Jeanette's hand is up, so I think Jeanette has the answer.
Maybe what companies should think of doing, just as they are, they don't intend to put out buggy software, they actually try to test and validate the software. Maybe they need some kind of red team in there that's specifically tasked to do the kind of forensic that Renee does outside the company. Because then when you're inside the company, you have interactions, you can look at the code and you can look at the data, you can look at all sorts of things that you can't. If you're outside the company, the forensics can be presumably that much more fine-grained. And maybe that should be common practice. What do you think, Renee?
Well, it is in cybersecurity, right? Like
Yeah.
testing is a thing.
So
both
now
outside and inside.
I'm extending it to just beyond.
I agree. No, I'm agreeing with you. I think so. We do communicate with the companies. Like Amazon. No, I actually couldn't figure out who to reach at Amazon. That was just like a wall. But the Silicon Valley companies, where you have friends on the data science team, that kind of thing. Like, I actually do regularly send stuff like, hey, I'm seeing this, you might want to have a look, like, especially with trending. Like, my newsfeed just changed, and they were doing that thing where they were trying to establish what an authoritative source was number, and they were going to put out a survey about it, which is Facebook's thing, and then all of a sudden I logged into Facebook the next day, 0 headings at the top of my trending stories, and I was like, I think whatever you just did didn't work. And here's a couple screenshots. I had like a witch blog that was, front and center in my trending stories. I was like, just have a look.
Well, getting to the point
So-
that you were raising about, do we have any tools that help us? I'm a company now, do we have any tools that help us monitor some of this? And like tools, we can have processes or committees or whatever you want to call them, people to actually, as step one, start monitoring this in a more systematic, methodological way. Eventually, maybe we can build scalable tools to help them.
Well, and they're hiring for that now. There's like Facebook has got job specs up for intelligence team. And then if you were interested in, doing things that are third party, the advantage I feel that we have as third party is that I can look and see how something is jumping from Facebook to Amazon.
Yeah.
That's where I feel like-
Particularly if they're not collaborating the way they do at least a little bit in information security.
Right, and so the question is, we have some work I'm doing now on like information security as cybersecurity, basically is thinking about it. You see a lot of like, does this live under the marketing officer because it's brand integrity, does this live under the CISO because it's cybersecurity? And we feel like there's kind of fall right down the middle on a lot of that. So it's an evolving field. I think it's a really interesting one. I think there's definitely a difference between going in-house, so to speak, and working on Facebook's threat intelligence team and looking at Facebook's garden. And then the secondary role for third-party researchers is really to look at the system.
Okay.
I hate to say that, having served on a community side or fact that this real function, which was very much one driven by thinking about standards, but very much thinking about principles, looking around novel businesses, occasionally reviewing. To me, it just this isn't the first kind of big bad sector that almost needs the world, right? I mean, I was in banking, the same thing happened, not to say that these functions work perfectly because we saw what happened there, but I think having a robust culture with that in place was helped to make it, to manage things a little better, but it just, these sectors are different. So if you think about healthcare, banking, generally, there's so much regulation that it is in the training as we graduate students. But the IT world is that's not in our training, and it should be now. And so you get this culture of that's how the Facebook's comes out.
But the first financial crash was 90 years ago. The information or cognitive security crash, arguably, is much more recent. Rachel?
You don't believe that these I feel like there's a big conflict of incentives. Like, so for example, with your Facebook friends who are data scientists, like, Professor Wiggins put up the VP's email, we are here to connect people. We are here to
It's
connect
not a conflict, and here's why. In the end, you rely on your customers. You need customers to be in business. So it's in the company's best interest to gain customer trust, your products and services. So the more that you can assure your customers that they have your best interests in mind, the better for them. I mean, this is a little highfalutin sounding, and perhaps it's with my Microsoft hat, but and perhaps Zuckerberg doesn't have that principle. More mature companies like. I mean, I just think in the end it's about customers,
right? But at the end of the Facebook, like even if I can work with scandal, most people are like, I can't even delete Facebook because it's so like embedded in my social network. Especially like I'm a fan of a data protection. The Middle East, she keeps bringing that out. Facebook, they need it. I mean, that's kind of like the.
So I'm sorry to interrupt that the online participants are saying they cannot hear very clearly. I think we should
Oh, the discussion.
that
presentation and then open the floor for discussion after the presentation.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'll just briefly say, you may not see how autonomy relates to any of this, but in fact, in legal circles, people have been thinking for a while about how search and recommendations do constrain autonomy, which is one of the ethical principles I'm pointing out. I guess I should start with you. This quote from 2008 is a good example by Frank Pasquale about writing about search. He says, meaningful autonomy requires more than simply an absence of some constraint. To control one's information flows in ways that shape and constrain her choice is to limit her autonomy, whether that person is deceived or not. Zeynep was just invoked. So Zeynep has another article more recently from January about, as she puts it, the democracy poisoning golden age of free speech. And she in particular connects this not only with autonomy, but free speech. She says this doesn't set off any First Amendment alarm bells, but it changes what we mean by censorship. If by censorship you mean making it impossible for somebody to speak, that's one way to make it impossible to get your message out. But another is to flood the world with so much chaff, so to speak, that you lower the signal to noise ratio. And those things can be gamed. I think when she says it doesn't erase First Amendment alarm bells, because many people who invoke the phrase, the First Amendment, I'm not sure if they've actually read the First Amendment, the first word of which is Congress, right? So if somebody says First Amendment, they probably mean freedom of speech as a principle. It's a good idea. They probably don't literally mean First Amendment, which constrains Congress from doing several things, number 3 of which is related to freedom of speech. A more optimistic take, slightly older than Frank Pasquale's work, is from Yochai Benkler. 2008, he wrote this book that was much more optimistic about the idea of the commons and the idea of the wealth of networks was the title of the book. And he also pointed out, if I flood you with information, I create a Babel in which it makes it impossible for you to have any ability to process information. As he writes, the core response to the Babel objection is then to accept that filtration is crucial to an autonomous individual. That is, you do not have autonomy if I only present you 2 sides to the story, because most stories have way more than 2 sides. You do not have autonomy if I flood you with so much chaff that you can't really process the world. You have to accept that. The only way to have autonomy is through some sort of filtration or curation, which is a tension, right? We like things to be simple. Good. So I'll close with that, my view on what is to be done. I wanted to give Renee the right of first refusal by pairing our talks. She probably has some ideas about particularly practical or impractical things that I'm proposing, and then we'll open it up more generally to discussion. Renee? Please.
No, I think the challenge for a lot of this is stuff that you all mentioned, which is how do we, where are the tensions between taking a regulatory approach versus encouraging platforms to do it internally? And that's a really popular topic in Silicon Valley right now. A lot of it is, I have a computer science degree also. I did it as an undergrad, and I happened to, for a brief period of time, thought I was going to double major with philosophy before winding up in political science. But I didn't have to take an ethics class as part of my CS curriculum. Just let you know, I graduated in 2004. And so thinking about, I had actually I'd never worked in academia, so I never had an IRB experience. And I would venture to guess that most of the engineers, a lot of these companies just don't, especially when you're a startup and you're trying to just get things done. And the culture in the Valley very much is like, ask forgiveness, right? And so how do you think about kind of inculcating these types of values in students before they leave, which is why it's so interesting to be here speaking to a room of folks who are tasked with just that challenge. So I think that a lot of what we're seeing in the Valley right now is the tension between the Lessig framework of laws and norms, markets and architecture, right? What do you lean on? Which of those sort of 4 forces can you lean on to affect change quickly? And I think
For an individual.
Right, for an
And then there
individual.
might be different forces that are more complicated.
Correct, exactly. So thinking about where, how do we think about creating that kind of culture in the engineering orgs of the companies? How do we think about creating that kind of culture, among data science students and computer science students? How do you introduce this into? How do you internalize it very early as opposed to trying to tack it on after the fact?
That is a correct.
Yeah. I'd love to do some questions. I have flight set to leave at like 1:30, but
Well,
yes.
I was gonna say, it's not that a regulation is necessarily the answer. There's one part of the question, what would that regulation look like? But the other is, one of the reasons I think Silicon Valley companies are so averse to regulation, or at least one of the arguments they give, is that it would suppress innovation. And so, do you have any thoughts on that tension?
You know, we hear that from, I was a trader on Wall Street for a long time. And you mentioned, I think it was, somebody mentioned the financial crisis, right? And we got the SEC after the financial collapse in the 1920s, right? The SEC was started after the Great Depression. But then in 2008, we had not only the SEC, but we had FINRA and we had the exchanges, and the exchanges stepped in. Sorry, 2008 is actually after what I'm talking about. 2008 was the financial crisis, but prior to that was when high frequency trading came to the markets in around 04, 05. And so we had already infrastructure in place to think about, okay, we have this new wave of automated trading. We have seen in the past, Black Monday, for example, unintended consequences of algorithmic interaction driving down markets. We have seen flash crashes. We have seen quote stuffing and other unethical behavior, algorithms that we would consider unethical. The fundamental thing where Wall Street gets it, I think, is recognizing that information integrity is absolutely key to the functioning of the market. Information integrity is key to literally the entire brand of the global financial system. If people don't trust, they won't trade. And that's where I think I don't think Silicon Valley has internalized that in quite the same way. This is the first real reckoning that the industry has faced. Yeah, there was the kind of dot-com bust where a lot of people lost money in bad investments, but it didn't have the societal impact. And it also didn't have the societal impact in the sense of regular users. You know, the one thing when Donald Trump was elected, I remember that night being on Twitter and seeing Twitter engineers wondering not just about the outcome of the election, but what did we do to public discourse? What did this thing that we built affect? And the sort of, you know, it's interesting that, you know, in sort of left-leaning or libertarian, depending on which side of the valley you're on, that the question started getting asked, I think, right around then. And this was when Zuckerberg was still saying fake news is a very small part of the sum total of all the stuff that you see on Facebook, which is objectively true. But then you get at, yes, at a population level, that's true, but at an individual tailored level, targeting of communities, the fact that you built a phenomenal targeting tool, the fact that your recommendation engine serves up content precisely to the people who are most likely to be receptive to it for good and for ill. How do we think about the impact, like the impact function, which has not really been, this is only the beginning of that in the Valley right now.
That was sort of my question, just in terms, like if you look at the Google suit by the European Union about algorithms, you know, bias towards advertisers, et cetera, I mean, the general public in that case, it doesn't really seem to affect their purchase patterns or their regulatory going back to the same sites. They just, I mean, it has very little effect on the valuation. So I love the idea of teaching, you know, engineers ethics. So it's, I think about the general public, they just don't seem to ethically, it doesn't seem to register that this company is misled them all this time.
I think that's true. I think it's also like, do they feel a personal impact? This was why during the tech hearings, like I did some advising during that of Congress, and we really wanted, Senator Blumenthal was the one who picked it up, but we really wanted them to push on the idea that they had to notify their customers. That the idea that the same way Equifax has to tell you when your data has been breached, the idea that someone who's been manipulating you should be disclosed to you, so that this is the sort of thing where we were really advocating for Congress to put pressure on the companies to do that. And that's the kind of thing where between Congress and then the news coverage, and then it's hard for Facebook to push to not do that in the face of, per your point, massive public shift indicating loss in trust.
Have you done